They thought the rifle was obsolete. The Marines wading ashore at Guadalcanal on the morning of August 7, 1942, carried bolt-action Springfield M1903 rifles that had been designed 4 decades earlier. The United States Army had already moved to the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as a soldier could pull the trigger. The Marine Corps had officially adopted the Garand the previous November, but adoption and distribution were different things entirely. Production couldn't keep up with demand. The Army got priority. The Marines, as always, made do with what they had. And what they had were bolt-action rifles that required a Marine to work the action manually between each shot. Rifles that held only 5 rounds in an internal magazine. Rifles that represented World War I technology being carried into a World War II battle. The Marines knew this. They knew the Army's new Garand was better, faster, more firepower. They knew that in a jungle fight, where combat happened at close range and happened fast, a semi-automatic rifle would be a significant advantage. They carried their Springfields anyway. Some Marines carried rifles that had been issued to them in the 1920s. Others had newer rifles, manufactured in the previous year at Remington's factories, still breaking in. But every Marine who came ashore that morning trusted the rifle in his hands, because he knew it absolutely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He had been issued that specific rifle at the beginning of boot camp and had carried it every day since. He had learned its weight, its balance, the exact pressure required on the trigger. He had disassembled it and reassembled it in darkness. He had qualified with it on the rifle range, lying prone at ranges extending to 500 yards, adjusting the rifle's graduated rear sight and learning to account for wind and distance. The Marine Corps had drilled into him that this rifle was his primary weapon, his most important tool, the instrument that would keep him alive and allow him to accomplish his mission. Marksmanship wasn't just a skill in the Marine Corps. It was a cult. Since 1908, when Marines began trading in their old Krag-Jorgensen rifles for the Springfield, competitive shooting had become a point of institutional pride. Marine shooting teams won national championships. The phrase "every Marine a rifleman" wasn't just a slogan, it was doctrine, drilled into every recruit from day one of training. The Springfield rifle these Marines carried had earned a legendary reputation. At Belleauwood in France in June of 1918, Marines equipped with these rifles had engaged German soldiers at ranges exceeding 800 yards. German troops, accustomed to combat at closer ranges, found themselves being killed by rifle fire from distances they considered impossible. Marine riflemen, lying prone in grass at Les Mares Farm, had carefully adjusted their sights and methodically cut down advancing German infantry before they could close to effective range. The Germans gave the Marines a nickname after those battles, Teufelhunden, devil dogs. The name stuck. Now, 24 years later, a new generation of Marines carried the same rifle design into a different kind of battle. The jungle terrain of Guadalcanal bore no resemblance to the wheat fields of France. Visibility extended to yards, not hundreds of yards. The Japanese they would fight were not the Germans their predecessors had faced, but the rifle remained the same. 5 shots, bolt action, 30-06 caliber, accurate, reliable, trusted. The question nobody could answer as the landing craft hit the beaches was simple. Would these old rifles be adequate for the kind of war the Marines were about to fight? Would bolt-action rifles carried by troops trained in long-range marksmanship be effective in close-quarters jungle combat against an enemy equipped with automatic weapons and a fanatical willingness to close with American positions? The Marines were confident in their rifles. They were confident in their training. They were about to discover if that confidence was justified. The rifle these Marines carried was officially designated the United States Rifle Caliber .30, Model 1903. To Marines, it was simply the .3. The design had been adopted in 1903, hence the designation, but the rifle had been refined and improved over 4 decades of service. It was based on the Mauser bolt-action mechanism, licensed from the German manufacturer after the United States military recognized the superiority of the Mauser design during the Spanish-American War in 1898. The Springfield was a remarkably simple weapon. It weighed 9.69 pounds, empty. Overall length was 43.2 inches. The barrel measured 24 inches. The bolt action was strong, smooth, and reliable. A trained rifleman could fire 15 aimed shots per minute, working the bolt and reloading from 5-round stripper clips. The magazine was internal, part of the receiver, and could not be removed. This was an old design philosophy. Load 5 rounds through the top of the action, work the bolt between shots, reload when empty. The rifle fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, a powerful round developed in 1906 specifically for this rifle. The cartridge fired a 150-grain bullet at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. This gave the rifle an effective range exceeding 800 yards with proper sighting. The graduated rear sight could be adjusted from 0 to 2,600 yards, though nobody expected to shoot at targets beyond 1,000 yards in combat. Marines loved this rifle for its accuracy. The Springfield had been designed as a target rifle as much as a battle rifle. The rear sight, while not ideal for quick target acquisition in combat, was excellent for precise long-range shooting. The barrel was of high quality. The action was smooth and consistent. A skilled marksman with a Springfield could place shots in a 6-inch circle at 300 yards. At longer ranges, with proper training and good ammunition, the rifle remained accurate to ranges where other infantry rifles began to lose effectiveness. But the rifle's greatest strength, from the Marine Corps perspective, was that it enforced marksmanship discipline. You had 5 shots. You couldn't spray bullets at the enemy. You had to aim. You had to make every shot count. You had to know your rifle, know your ammunition, know your target's range, and execute proper shooting fundamentals. Breath control, trigger squeeze, sight alignment, natural point of aim. These were not suggestions, they were requirements. The Marine Corps had institutionalized marksmanship training in a way no other American military branch had. When Commandant Major General Charles Haywood discovered in 1907 that out of 6,000 Marines, only 89 had qualified as marksmen or sharpshooters, he ordered a complete overhaul of marksmanship training. He established a regular program for rifle qualification and appointed a first inspector of target practice to manage the program. Within a few years, Marines were winning inter-service shooting competitions and establishing themselves as the finest marksmen in the American military. This emphasis on marksmanship became part of Marine Corps identity. A Marine's rifle qualification score mattered for promotion. A Marine who couldn't qualify was a failure, regardless of his other skills. The rifle range was where Marines proved themselves. The 3 qualification levels, marksman, sharpshooter, and expert, weren't just badges worn on the uniform. They were statements about a Marine's competence, his discipline, his worth to the Corps. When Marines went through recruit training, they spent weeks on marksmanship. They learned the fundamentals of shooting. They practiced dry firing, working the bolt and squeezing the trigger without ammunition, learning muscle memory and consistency. They spent hours in the prone position with a rifle sling pulled tight, learning how to breathe, how to relax, how to make the rifle an extension of their body. They fired thousands of practice rounds, receiving immediate feedback from instructors who could diagnose problems and correct techniques. By the time a Marine qualified, he could shoot. The training emphasized long-range precision shooting. The rifle range at Marine Corps training bases featured targets at 200 yards, 300 yards, and 500 yards. Marines learned to adjust their sights for different ranges. They learned to read wind. They learned to account for the effects of temperature and altitude on bullet trajectory. This was not point-and-shoot training. This was marksmanship as a technical skill. Marines who went through this training in the late 1930s and early 1940s came out believing they were superior marksmen. They had qualified at ranges the Army didn't even attempt. They could hit targets at distances that seemed impossible to soldiers trained on combat ranges, emphasizing closer engagements. They trusted their rifles and they trusted their training. This confidence was not misplaced when it came to the rifle itself. The Springfield was genuinely accurate. It was reliable. Marines took care of their rifles, cleaning them meticulously, treating them as precision instruments rather than just weapons. A Marine's rifle was kept clean, properly lubricated, and carefully maintained. The rifle culture in the Marine Corps ensured that weapons were in good condition, but there was an assumption built into all of this training and culture. The assumption was that marksmanship, meaning accuracy at long range, would be the decisive factor in combat. The assumption was that a well-trained Marine with an accurate rifle, engaging targets at ranges where his training gave him an advantage, would prevail over less skilled opponents. The assumption was that 5 well-aimed shots were better than 8 hasty shots. These assumptions were about to be tested. The jungle terrain of Guadalcanal, where visibility was measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards, where ambushes happened at spitting distance, where combat was confused and chaotic and fast, would not resemble the rifle ranges where Marines had trained. The Japanese they would fight had their own doctrines, their own weapons, their own willingness to die rather than retreat. The question was whether Marines armed with bolt-action rifles, trained to engage at long range, would be at a disadvantage in close-quarters jungle combat. The 1st Marine Division that landed on Guadalcanal represented the largest Marine combat force ever assembled. Major General Alexander Archer Vandergrift commanded approximately 11,000 Marines, organized into infantry regiments, artillery battalions, engineer units, and support elements. Most of these Marines were young. Many had enlisted after Pearl Harbor and had less than a year of training. Some were veterans of peacetime service, hard-bitten sergeants and staff sergeants who had served in China or in the Caribbean during the Banana Wars. But the majority were new Marines, carrying into combat the training they had received and the rifles they had been issued. The mission was straightforward. Seize the airfield the Japanese were building at Lunga Point. Deny the Japanese use of Guadalcanal as a base from which to threaten Allied supply lines between the United States and Australia. Hold the island. The simplicity of the mission statement concealed the difficulty of execution. Guadalcanal was approximately 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in jungle and mountains, with no roads except a coastal track. The Japanese had construction units and combat troops on the island. Intelligence estimates of Japanese strength were incomplete and probably understated the actual number of enemy personnel present. The landing itself went smoothly. Japanese forces withdrew from the beaches without offering significant resistance. By nightfall on August 8th, Marines had secured the airfield and established a defensive perimeter. The Japanese left behind supplies, equipment, and construction machinery. Marines immediately began improving the airfield, which would be renamed Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. But on the night of August 8th and 9th, Japanese naval forces attacked the Allied fleet, supporting the landing. In the Battle of Savo Island, Japanese cruisers and destroyers surprised and defeated the Allied screening force, sinking 4 cruisers and damaging other vessels. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner withdrew the remaining Allied naval forces, taking with them the transports that had not yet been unloaded. Marines ashore were left with only 5 days' worth of rations and limited artillery ammunition. Heavy equipment, additional supplies, and reinforcements would have to wait. The Marines dug in. They improved defensive positions. They sent patrols into the surrounding jungle to determine Japanese locations and strength. They worked on the airfield, knowing that once it was operational, American aircraft could provide air cover and strike Japanese positions. They waited. And they carried their Springfield rifles. The rifles had been issued from Marine Corps armories before the division deployed. Some rifles were old, manufactured at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts or at Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois in the 1920s or early 1930s. These rifles showed wear. The bluing was worn at points of contact. The wood stocks bore scratches and dings from years of service, but they were serviceable weapons, carefully maintained through multiple overhauls at Marine Corps depot facilities. The actions were smooth, the barrels were still accurate. These were veteran rifles, carried by Marines in training and peacetime garrison duty, now being carried into combat. Other rifles were newer, manufactured by Remington Arms in 1941 and 1942 as the United States mobilized for war. These rifles were designated M1903A3, a simplified variant designed for faster production. The finish was darker, using a different phosphate process. Some parts were stamped rather than machined, reducing production time and cost. The rear sight was different, a simpler aperture sight mounted on the rear of the receiver, rather than the elaborate ladder sight of earlier Springfields. But fundamentally, these were the same rifle, same action, same caliber, same 5-round capacity, same bolt operation. Marines treated these rifles with the same respect, regardless of age. A rifle was cleaned every day, whether it had been fired or not. Bore cleaning, action cleaning, proper lubrication. Marines used government-issue cleaning kits and oil. They inspected their rifles for rust, for damage, for any sign of malfunction. They test-fired when possible to ensure zero hadn't shifted. This was ritual, ingrained through training, enforced by sergeants and officers who understood that rifles were not expendable, but were precision tools requiring maintenance. The ammunition Marines carried was also Government Issue 30-06. Ball ammunition, designated M2, with a 150-grain full metal jacket bullet. This was good ammunition, manufactured to military specifications, consistent and reliable. Each Marine carried between 80 and 100 rounds in cloth bandoliers or in individual stripper clips in cartridge belts. Additional ammunition was stored in company and battalion dumps, rationed carefully, given the limited supplies landed before the fleet withdrew. Marines also carried bayonets. The M1905 bayonet was a 16-inch blade designed to fit the Springfield rifle's bayonet lug. Some Marines sharpened their bayonets religiously. Others left them dull, reasoning that a bayonet was more useful as a tool than as a weapon. But the bayonet remained part of a Marine rifleman's equipment, a reminder that combat sometimes came to distances measured in feet rather than yards. The confidence Marines had in their rifles was not just about the weapon. It was about the entire system. Rifle, ammunition, training, culture. The belief that a Marine rifleman, properly trained and properly equipped, was the equal of any infantry soldier in any army. The belief that marksmanship mattered. The belief that accuracy and discipline would prevail over volume of fire and aggression. This belief was about to face its first real test. Within 2 weeks of landing on Guadalcanal, Marines would fight a night battle at the Tenaru River, where Japanese infantry would launch a frontal assault against Marine defensive positions. Marines would discover whether bolt-action rifles were adequate against an enemy attacking in darkness with automatic weapons and grenades. They would discover whether their training in long-range precision shooting would translate to effectiveness in close-quarters combat. They would discover whether the Springfield rifle, designed 4 decades earlier for a different kind of warfare, could still be trusted when lives depended on it. The Marines didn't know any of this as they dug fighting positions and strung barbed wire around Henderson Field. They knew only that they had landed on a hostile island, that the fleet had withdrawn, leaving them undersupplied and isolated, and that Japanese forces somewhere on Guadalcanal would eventually counterattack. When that counterattack came, Marines would have the rifles they had always had, the training they had always received, and the confidence they had always carried. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. The Japanese attacked Henderson Field for the first time on August 13, 1942, with naval bombardment from cruisers offshore. Marines in their defensive positions experienced their first taste of high-explosive shells detonating in the jungle, the concussion waves, the flying shrapnel, the terror of being unable to shoot back at ships beyond visual range. The bombardment lasted 20 minutes. It accomplished little tactically, but demonstrated that Japanese forces were not going to abandon Guadalcanal without a fight. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese forces were gathering east of the marine perimeter. Coastwatcher scouts, Solomon Islanders, who remained behind enemy lines to observe and report Japanese movements, sent warnings through radio channels. Japanese ships had been observed landing troops and supplies at Tenaru Point, approximately 20 miles east of Henderson Field. The exact size and composition of these Japanese forces remained unknown, but clearly a counterattack was being prepared. On August 19th, Captain Charles Brush led a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, along the coastal trail toward Coley Point. The patrol consisted of approximately 60 Marines carrying their Springfield rifles, moving cautiously through coconut groves and jungle growth. Their mission was reconnaissance, to determine Japanese strength and positions east of the perimeter. Late in the afternoon, the patrol encountered a Japanese force, moving west along the same trail. The firefight was brief and violent. Marines opened fire at close range, perhaps 50 yards. Springfield rifles cracked in rapid succession. Marines worked bolts, ejected spent. Cartridge cases, chambered fresh rounds, fired again. The Japanese force, caught in the open, suffered heavily. When the firing stopped, 31 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Marines captured important documents, including maps and orders that revealed Japanese intentions. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was bringing approximately 900 soldiers of the 28th Infantry Regiment to attack Henderson Field and drive the Americans off Guadalcanal. Marine intelligence officers studied the captured documents. Ichiki's orders were explicit. His regiment would land at Tenaru Point, march west, and assault the American positions in a night attack. The Japanese High Command believed American forces on Guadalcanal numbered fewer than 2,000 men. This was a massive underestimation. In reality, approximately 11,000 Marines held the perimeter, but Ichiki apparently believed his elite regiment could overwhelm what he assumed was a small American garrison. General Vandergrift, now, knew an attack was coming. He didn't know exactly when or where, but the captured documents and intelligence intercepts gave him enough information to prepare. He ordered defensive positions strengthened. He positioned infantry battalions to cover the most likely approaches. He ensured artillery was registered on potential avenues of attack, and he waited. The defensive line east of Henderson Field followed the west bank of a tidal lagoon that Marines had labeled Alligator Creek on their maps. The actual name was the Tenaru River, but Marines thought they were defending the Tenaru River, which was actually 2,000 yards farther east. The battle that would follow would be incorrectly named the Battle of the Tenaru, but the name stuck in history books despite the geographic error. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, held this sector. Machine gun positions covered the sandbar where the lagoon met the ocean. Riflemen occupied fighting positions along the west bank. Barbed wire had been strung across likely approach routes. 37mm anti-tank guns were positioned to provide direct fire support. Artillery from the 11th Marines, the division's artillery regiment, was registered on the area east of the creek, where attacking forces would have to mass before crossing. The Marines in these positions carried their Springfield rifles. They had cleaned and inspected their weapons that afternoon. They had checked ammunition supplies. Each rifleman had at least 80 rounds immediately available, with additional ammunition stored in nearby positions. They had test-fired their rifles to ensure functioning. They were as ready as training and preparation could make them. But most of these Marines had never been in combat before. They had fired their rifles on training ranges at known distances against stationary targets. They had practiced working the bolt action until muscle memory made the motion automatic. They had learned to aim, to squeeze the trigger smoothly, to follow through on each shot. But they had never fired at another human being who was shooting back. They had never experienced the confusion and fear of night combat. They had never discovered whether their training would hold when lives depended on split-second decisions. The Japanese had their own doctrine and their own beliefs. Colonel Ichiki commanded elite troops, soldiers who had fought in China and Manchuria. His men believed in their superior fighting spirit. They believed that aggressive night attacks would overwhelm American defenders. They believed that bayonet charges and close combat would negate American advantages in firepower. They were confident, perhaps overconfident, in their ability to defeat what they assumed was a small, inexperienced American force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They were about to discover that the Marines defending Henderson Field were neither small in number nor unprepared, and the Marines were about to discover whether their bolt-action rifles and long-range marksmanship training would be adequate for the kind of combat they were about to experience. At approximately midnight on August 21st, 1942, Marines in listening posts forward of the main defensive line heard movement in the darkness. Japanese soldiers were approaching through the coconut groves east of the creek. The listening posts fired several warning shots and withdrew to the main line. Officers along the defensive perimeter were alerted. Marines in fighting positions gripped their rifles tighter and stared into the darkness, trying to see movement, trying to hear footsteps or equipment sounds over the constant noise of jungle insects and surf breaking on the beach. At 1:30 in the morning, the Japanese attacked. Machine gun fire erupted from the east bank of the creek. Mortar rounds began falling in Marine positions. Then came the assault itself, Japanese infantry charging across the sandbar and into the water, bayonets fixed, officers leading with drawn swords, soldiers shouting battle cries intended to intimidate and unnerve the defenders. Marines opened fire. Machine gunners traversed their weapons across the sandbar and the water, firing long bursts. The Browning M1917 water-cooled 30-caliber machine guns hammered out rounds at a rate of 450 per minute. Tracers arced across the darkness, showing gunners where rounds were impacting. The machine gun fire was devastating. Japanese soldiers fell in the water and on the sandbar, cut down before they could reach the American positions. But the machine guns alone couldn't stop the attack. Japanese soldiers kept coming. Some made it across the creek and reached the barbed wire. A few penetrated the defensive line, breaking into Marine positions and fighting, hand to hand with bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools. The fighting was savage and close. Marines killed Japanese soldiers in their fighting holes and were killed themselves when overwhelmed by multiple attackers. This was where the Springfield rifle faced its test. In the darkness, in close combat, with confusion and fear and chaos, Marines had to work bolt-action rifles under conditions nothing like the rifle range. They couldn't see their sights clearly. They couldn't judge range accurately. Targets weren't standing still at known distances. They were moving shapes in darkness, sometimes only feet away, sometimes mixed in with other Marines so that shooting risked hitting friendly forces. Marines fired. Worked the bolt. Fired again. The motion was automatic, drilled through thousands of repetitions in training. Bolt back, eject the spent case. Bolt forward, chamber a new round. Aim, fire. Some Marines fired their 5 rounds and had to reload, fumbling for stripper clips in the present. Darkness, inserting them into the magazine, stripping rounds down into the receiver, closing the bolt. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, precious time when Japanese soldiers were only yards away. Private First Class Al Schmid manned a machine gun position near the sandbar. His assistant gunner was killed early in the fight. His loader was badly wounded. Schmid continued firing the machine gun alone, feeding belts of ammunition, clearing jams, traversing the weapon to engage Japanese soldiers crossing the creek. He fired until a Japanese grenade exploded near his position, wounding him severely and blinding him. But he had fired approximately 200 rounds, killing dozens of Japanese soldiers before his position was finally overwhelmed. Marines with Springfield rifles provided supporting fire. They aimed at muzzle flashes from Japanese weapons. They shot at movement in the darkness. They killed Japanese soldiers attempting to flank machine gun positions or to advance through gaps in the defensive line. The rifle fire wasn't the long-range precision shooting they had trained for. It was rapid fire at close range, shooting as fast as they could work the bolt action, putting rounds into target areas rather than aiming at specific enemy soldiers they could clearly see. The Japanese attack continued for hours. Waves of infantry charged the Marine positions. Officers with drawn swords led men across the sandbar only to be cut down by machine gun fire. Soldiers who made it across the creek were killed in the wire or shot as they tried to penetrate the defensive line. The coconut grove east of the creek became a killing ground, illuminated by muzzle flashes and tracer fire, littered with bodies. By dawn, the Japanese attack had failed. Colonel Ichiki's regiment had been shattered. Approximately 800 of his 900 soldiers were dead or dying. The survivors, perhaps 128 men, had retreated back toward Taivu Point. The Marines had held their positions and inflicted catastrophic casualties on the attackers. After daybreak, Marines counterattacked. Companies from 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, crossed the creek and swept through the coconut grove. They killed Japanese soldiers, attempting to hide or to set up final defensive positions. M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and drove through the grove, crushing Japanese soldiers beneath their tracks and firing their 37mm guns and machine guns at any remaining resistance. By late afternoon, organized Japanese resistance had ended. Marines walked through the battlefield afterward, collecting weapons and documents, identifying enemy dead, searching for wounded who might be taken prisoner. The scene was horrific. Bodies lay in the water, on the sandbar, throughout the coconut grove. The concentration of fire from Marine positions had been overwhelming. Japanese soldiers had been killed while still in the water, shot before they could reach the American line. Others had died in the wire or in the fighting holes they had briefly captured before being killed by counter-attacking Marines. Marines examining the battlefield discovered something important. The Japanese soldiers they had killed were not poorly trained conscripts. These were elite troops, carrying excellent equipment, armed with modern weapons. The Japanese used the Arisaka Type 38 rifle, a bolt-action weapon comparable to the Springfield in many respects. But they also carried light machine guns, the Type 96, which provided automatic fire that the Marine rifle squads lacked except for their Browning automatic rifles. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive tactics, night attacks, and close combat. They trained to close with the enemy and fight at bayonet range where Japanese soldiers believed their superior fighting spirit would prevail. The Marine victory at the Tenaru demonstrated several things. First, that well-prepared defensive positions, properly sighted and supported by crew-served weapons, could defeat even the most aggressive infantry assault. Second, that Marine marksmanship training, even though it emphasized long-range shooting, translated into effectiveness at close range when Marines had the discipline to aim and fire accurately under pressure. Third, that the Springfield rifle, despite being a bolt-action design, remained an effective infantry weapon when used by trained riflemen. But the Marines also learned limitations. The Springfield's 5-round capacity meant that in sustained close combat, Marines had to reload frequently. Working the bolt action took time, fractions of a second that could be critical when multiple attackers were closing on a position. The rifle's length, 43 inches overall, made it somewhat unwieldy in the cramped fighting holes and dense vegetation. The lack of a detachable magazine meant reloading required either inserting individual rounds or using stripper clips, both slower than changing a magazine on a more modern rifle design. Marines who survived the Battle of the Tenaru respected their Springfield rifles. The weapons had functioned flawlessly. They had fired thousands of rounds without significant malfunctions. The rifles were accurate even at close range, even firing rapidly, even under the worst combat conditions. But Marines also began to understand that they would face an enemy who attacked aggressively, who closed to point-blank range, who fought with a ferocity that required maximum firepower to defeat. Some Marines began acquiring Japanese weapons as trophies and keeping them as backup weapons. Others wished desperately for the M1 Garand that army units were receiving. The casualty figures told the story. Marines had lost approximately 40 men killed and 75 wounded. Japanese losses exceeded 800 killed. The kill ratio was approximately 20-1 in favor of the Marines. This was not just about rifles. This was about defensive positions, crew-served weapons, artillery support, and tactical skill. But the rifles had played their part. Marines armed with bolt-action Springfields, properly trained and properly positioned, had defeated a numerically inferior but tactically aggressive enemy force. Marine riflemen had fired their weapons as trained. They had aimed. They had worked their bolt actions smoothly and quickly. They had maintained fire discipline, not wasting ammunition on targets they couldn't hit. They had reloaded efficiently when magazines ran dry. They had used their rifles to kill enemy soldiers at ranges from 5 feet to 100 yards, adapting long-range marksmanship training to the reality of close-quarters jungle combat. But this was only the first major engagement. More battles would follow. The Japanese would send larger forces to Guadalcanal, learning from Ichiki's failure, adapting their tactics, bringing more troops and heavier weapons. Marines would fight at Edson's Ridge in September, at the Tenaru River in October, at Henderson Field in October, when Japanese artillery shelled the airfield, and Japanese infantry attacked the perimeter in regimental strength. Each battle would test Marines and their rifles. Each engagement would reveal more about what worked and what didn't. After the Battle of the Tenaru, Marine armourers collected Springfield rifles and inspected them for damage or excessive wear. Most rifles had fired between 50 and 200 rounds during the night battle. The armourers cleaned each weapon, checked headspace, examined barrels for erosion, tested actions for smooth function. They found remarkably few problems. The rifles had performed as designed. The .30-06 ammunition had functioned reliably. The bolt actions had cycled smoothly, even when covered in sand, mud, and saltwater spray. Marines continued carrying their Springfield rifles through the rest of August and into September, but behind the scenes, logistics officers were working to get M1 Garands shipped to Guadalcanal. Army units arriving as reinforcements brought their Garands with them. Marines began trading Springfield rifles for captured Japanese weapons, or for Garands acquired from army units. The transition was gradual but inevitable. The Springfield had proven adequate, but adequate wasn't the same as optimal. Given a choice, Marines wanted the faster-firing, higher-capacity Garand. The broader lesson was about doctrine and training. Marine marksmanship culture, built around long-range precision shooting with the Springfield rifle, had produced riflemen who could adapt to close-range combat. The discipline required to shoot accurately at 500 yards translated into steady shooting at 50 yards. The muscle memory developed through thousands of repetitions working the bolt action meant Marines could reload and fire quickly even under stress. The confidence that came from mastering a precision instrument meant Marines trusted their rifles to function when needed. But the combat experience also revealed that American infantry doctrine needed to emphasize firepower as much as marksmanship. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand provided a significant tactical advantage in close combat. Light machine guns at the squad level, which the Marines lacked but which Japanese squads possessed, provided suppressive fire that could pin down enemy forces. The Springfield rifle, excellent as it was, represented old doctrine being adapted to new realities. The 1st Marine Division remained on Guadalcanal for 4 months after the Battle of the Tenaru. They fought at Edson's Ridge on September 13th and 14th, where Japanese forces came within yards of breaking through to Henderson Field. They fought at the Tenaru River repeatedly through September and October, establishing and re-establishing defensive lines against Japanese counterattacks. They fought in late October when Japanese artillery finally brought ashore in sufficient quantities, bombarded Marine positions while infantry attacked in regimental strength. Through all these battles, most Marines still carried Springfield rifles. The situation changed slowly. Supply ships bringing ammunition and rations to Guadalcanal also brought weapons. M1 Garand rifles arrived in crates, unpacked by armourers, issued to units as they became available. The distribution was not uniform. Some companies received Garands in September, others kept their Springfields into November. Priority went to units in the most active sectors, to scout sniper platoons who needed the firepower, to machine gun units whose security required better individual weapons. Marines receiving Garands had mixed reactions. Some were thrilled. The Garand was everything the Springfield wasn't: 8-round capacity instead of 5, semi-automatic action instead of bolt action, faster reloading with N-block clips instead of stripper clips or individual rounds. The ability to fire as rapidly as a Marine could pull the trigger without working a bolt between shots. For close-quarters jungle combat, these advantages were significant. Other Marines were less enthusiastic. The Garand weighed more than the Springfield, 9.5 pounds loaded compared to approximately 10 pounds for the Springfield with ammunition. The Garand was longer, 43.6 inches overall compared to 43.2 inches for the Springfield, though the difference was negligible. More importantly, the Garand was unfamiliar. Marines had trained with the Springfield. They knew its characteristics, its quirks, its behavior under different conditions. The Garand was new. Learning a new rifle in combat, without proper range time to zero the weapon and practice with it, was not ideal. But the Marines adapted. They learned the Garand's manual of arms. They practiced loading the N-block clips, learning to avoid the infamous Monet thumb where the bolt could slam forward on a careless thumb when loading. They learned the weapon's balance, its recoil characteristics, its accuracy at different ranges. They discovered that the Garand's gas-operated action was reliable even in the harsh jungle environment, though it required different maintenance procedures than the simple bolt-action Springfield. By December 1942, when the 1st Marine Division was withdrawn from Guadalcanal and replaced by Army and fresh Marine units, approximately half the division's riflemen carried Garands. The other half still had Springfield rifles. The transition was incomplete but underway. When the division reached Australia for rest and refitting, armourers collected the remaining Springfields and issued Garands to every rifleman. The Springfield's time as a frontline Marine infantry rifle was ending, but the Springfield didn't disappear. Marine scout sniper units continued using specially selected Springfield rifles, often fitted with unertl, 8-power telescopic sights, throughout the war. These rifles, chosen for exceptional accuracy, served as effective sniper weapons. The Springfield's bolt action, which had been a disadvantage for regular infantry in close combat, was an advantage for snipers who needed a single, accurate shot rather than rapid fire. Marine snipers using Springfield rifles engaged Japanese soldiers at ranges exceeding 600 yards, providing reconnaissance and target elimination that supported infantry operations. The Springfield also remained in service as a grenade launcher platform. The Moan rifle grenade launcher, a spigot-type device that attached to the rifle's muzzle, was designed for the Springfield. Grenadiers in Marine units continued carrying Springfields even after riflemen transitioned to Garands, using their rifles to launch anti-tank grenades and high-explosive grenades at ranges exceeding 200 yards. This role kept the Springfield in Marine units through 1943 and into 1944. Reserve and support units also retained Springfield rifles long after frontline infantry received Garands. Military police, shore patrol, artillery units, aviation ground crews, and headquarters personnel carried Springfields because these units had lower priority for new weapons. When these Marines found themselves in combat, which happened more frequently than doctrine anticipated, they fought with the rifles they had. At places like Henderson Field, when Japanese artillery and infantry threatened the airfield perimeter, rear-echelon Marines with Springfield rifles manned defensive positions alongside infantry. The Marine Corps' attachment to the Springfield reflected a deeper cultural truth. Marines had built an institutional identity around marksmanship with this rifle. Generations of Marines had qualified on rifle ranges with the Springfield. The Corps' reputation for producing expert riflemen was inseparable from the rifle that had served from World War I through the early Pacific campaigns of World War II. Giving up the Springfield meant acknowledging that firepower mattered as much as accuracy, that modern infantry combat required different weapons than those that had served in earlier wars. The Guadalcanal campaign concluded on February 9, 1943, when the last Japanese forces evacuated the island. American casualties for the entire campaign totaled approximately 7,000, including 1,600 killed. Japanese casualties exceeded 31,000, including 19,000 killed and 11,000 dead from disease and starvation. The campaign had been brutal, consuming men and resources on both sides, but it marked a decisive turning point in the Pacific War. After Guadalcanal, Japan was on the strategic defensive. The Allies had seized the initiative and would not relinquish it. The Marines who fought on Guadalcanal, whether armed with Springfield rifles or Garands, had proven that American infantry could defeat Japanese forces in sustained combat. The myth of Japanese invincibility, built on their victories at Pearl Harbor, Philippines, Singapore, and across Southeast Asia, had been shattered. Japanese infantry, despite their training, their experience, and their willingness to die rather than surrender, could not overcome American firepower, logistics, and determination. The Springfield Rifles' performance on Guadalcanal entered Marine Corps legend. Marines told stories of riflemen who had held defensive positions with bolt-action rifles against charging Japanese infantry. They spoke of the rifles' reliability in the worst conditions, firing thousands of rounds without malfunction despite mud, sand, salt water, and jungle humidity. They remembered the accuracy that came from proper marksmanship training, the ability to hit targets even in darkness and confusion, because they had learned to shoot correctly. But the Marines also learned that the rifle itself, however good, was only one factor in combat effectiveness. Tactics mattered. Leadership mattered. Combined arms coordination, bringing together infantry, artillery, machine guns, and air support, mattered more than individual weapons characteristics. The Springfield had been adequate on Guadalcanal, not because it was the best possible infantry rifle, but because Marines had used it correctly within a larger tactical system that emphasized defense, firepower, and mutual support. The transition to the Garand represented the Marine Corps adapting to lessons learned. If the Springfield had proven completely inadequate, Marines would have suffered catastrophic casualties and possibly lost Guadalcanal. That didn't happen. But combat experience revealed that semi-automatic rifles provided tactical advantages that bolt-action rifles couldn't match. The Garand's 8-round capacity and faster rate of fire gave Marines more options in combat. They could suppress enemy positions while maneuvering. They could engage multiple targets rapidly. They could maintain fire while moving, something difficult with a bolt-action rifle. The broader lesson was about institutional conservatism versus tactical reality. The Marine Corps had been slow to adopt the Garand not because Marines failed to recognize its advantages, but because of procurement priorities and limited production capacity. The Army, being larger, received Garands first. The Marines made do with Springfields because those were the rifles available. But this forced the Corps to rely on marksmanship culture and training to compensate for weapons that were, by 1942 standards, obsolete. This reliance on marksmanship culture produced unexpected benefits. Marines trained with the Springfield learned fire discipline. They learned that ammunition was precious and that every shot had to count. They learned rifle maintenance because a malfunctioning rifle meant losing 5 rounds, not just 1. They learned to aim carefully because they couldn't rely on volume of fire to hit targets. These lessons translated into making Marines better riflemen even after they received Garands. Marines with Garands didn't spray bullets at targets. They aimed. They fired controlled pairs or short bursts. They maintained weapons carefully. The discipline learned with the Springfield carried forward with the new rifle. Post-war analysis of infantry weapons effectiveness in the Pacific confirmed what Marines had experienced on Guadalcanal. Bolt-action rifles were adequate for defensive combat when supported by crew-served weapons and proper tactics. They were less effective for offensive operations requiring rapid fire and maneuver. The Springfield's long-range accuracy was valuable for snipers and designated marksmen, but less critical for regular riflemen, whose combat typically occurred at ranges under 200 yards. The Garand's advantages in firepower and reload speed outweighed its slightly increased weight and complexity. But the Springfield's greatest legacy wasn't tactical, it was cultural. The rifle represented an era when marksmanship was considered the defining characteristic of a Marine rifleman. The phrase, "every Marine a rifleman," which became official Marine Corps doctrine in later decades, traced its roots to the marksmanship culture built around the Springfield. The rifle range remained central to Marine training not because the Springfield was still in service, but because the principles learned shooting the Springfield, accuracy, discipline, fire control, and weapon maintenance, remained fundamental to being an effective infantryman, regardless of what rifle a Marine carried. Marines who had carried the Springfield at Belleau Wood in 1918 and at Guadalcanal in 1942 shared a common experience. They had proven that training and discipline could overcome tactical disadvantages. They had shown that old equipment, properly used by skilled personnel, could still be effective. They had maintained standards and traditions, even as warfare evolved around them. When the Marine Corps finally retired the Springfield from frontline service, it wasn't abandoning these principles. It was acknowledging that modern warfare required modern tools, but that the fundamental skills remained constant. The Springfield served in Marine sniper units through the Korean War. Some rifles saw action in Vietnam in the early 1960s. These were specialized applications, using the rifle's inherent accuracy for missions where a single well-placed shot mattered more than rate of fire. But for regular infantry, the Springfield's era had ended. The rifle belonged to history, remembered and respected, but no longer adequate for contemporary combat. The Marines who waded ashore at Guadalcanal carrying Springfield rifles believed those rifles would be adequate. They were right, but barely. If the Japanese had attacked with larger forces, initially, if they had brought more automatic weapons and artillery, if they had coordinated their offensives more effectively, the Springfield's limitations might have proven fatal. The Marines won at the Tenaru not because the Springfield was superior to Japanese weapons, but because Marine training, tactics, and fighting positions maximized what the rifle could do while minimizing what it couldn't. The truth these Marines discovered was uncomfortable. Their beloved Springfield, the rifle around which Marine marksmanship culture had been built, was obsolete. Not useless, not ineffective, but obsolete in the sense that better alternatives existed. The Garand provided firepower advantages that no amount of marksmanship training could overcome. A Marine with a Garand could fire more shots, faster, with quicker reloads. In close combat, in the jungle, in the confused violence of infantry fighting, these advantages mattered. But acknowledging this truth didn't diminish what the Springfield represented. The rifle had served faithfully for 4 decades. It had equipped Marines at Belleau Wood, in the Banana Wars, in China, and in the opening battles of the Pacific War. It had proven accurate, reliable, and robust. Marines who had mastered the Springfield were genuinely skilled marksmen, capable of hitting targets at ranges that seemed impossible with iron sights and a bolt-action rifle. The training system built around this rifle had produced infantry of exceptional quality. The cost of this truth was accepting that tradition and institutional identity had to adapt to tactical reality. The Marine Corps valued its marksmanship culture and its connection to the Springfield rifle, but the Corps valued effectiveness more. When combat experience proved that semi-automatic rifles provided significant advantages, the Marines transitioned to the Garand despite the institutional attachment to the older weapon. This wasn't abandoning tradition, it was honoring tradition. By adapting to ensure Marines remained effective in combat, individual Marines paid a different cost. Those who fought with Springfield rifles on Guadalcanal wondered afterward if they would have survived certain situations with a Garand instead. When Japanese soldiers charged positions and Marines were working bolt actions frantically between shots, when 5 rounds weren't enough and reloading took precious seconds. When the difference between living and dying came down to rate of fire rather than accuracy, Marines questioned whether they had been given the best tools for the job. They had won anyway, through courage and skill and determination, but they knew they had fought at a disadvantage that didn't need to exist. The Japanese had learned a different lesson from Guadalcanal. Their tactics, emphasizing aggressive night attacks and close combat, had failed against prepared defensive positions. Their contempt for American fighting ability had proven unfounded. Their belief that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantages had been shattered. The Japanese would continue fighting with fanatical determination throughout the Pacific War, but after Guadalcanal, they knew that American forces, properly led and equipped, were formidable opponents. The Springfield Rifles' story on Guadalcanal is ultimately about adaptation and institutional learning. The Marines went into battle with the rifles they had, not the rifles they wanted. They made those rifles work through superior training, sound tactics, and individual courage. But they also recognized when their equipment was inadequate and pushed for better weapons. The transition from Springfield to Garand wasn't immediate or smooth, but it happened because Marines demanded tools equal to the missions they faced. This same pattern would repeat throughout the war. Equipment that had been adequate in one context proved insufficient in another. Units adapted. They requisitioned new weapons. They modified tactics. They learned from combat experience and applied those lessons to improve effectiveness. The Marine Corps that ended World War II looked very different from the Corps that landed on Guadalcanal in terms of equipment, doctrine, and organization. But the fundamental identity, every Marine a rifleman, remained constant because that identity was about training and mindset rather than any specific weapon. The Marines who carried Springfield rifles at Guadalcanal earned their place in history. They stopped the first major Japanese offensive. They held Henderson Field against repeated attacks. They proved that American infantry could win in sustained ground combat against an experienced and determined enemy. They did this with bolt-action rifles designed 4 decades earlier, with limited supplies, with inadequate support, in terrain that favored the defense but required constant vigilance and courage. These Marines didn't need to apologize for their rifles. The Springfield had done its job. It had fired when needed. It had hit targets when aimed properly. It had survived conditions that would have destroyed less robust weapons. But these Marines also knew that war isn't about fairness or tradition. It's about effectiveness. And when a better rifle became available, they took it. Not because they didn't trust the Springfield, but because they understood that in combat, every advantage matters. The Springfield Rifles' service with the Marine Corps ended not in shame, but in honor. It had served well. It had earned its reputation. It had proven adequate when adequate was enough. But adequate isn't the same as optimal, and Marines insisted on optimal when their lives depended on their weapons. The Springfield's legacy wasn't failure. It was laying the foundation for a marksmanship culture that would outlast any specific rifle and defining standards of accuracy and discipline that remain Marine Corps values today. When Marines today qualify on modern rifles, firing at prise, targets at ranges the Springfield once engaged, they inherit a tradition built on that old bolt-action rifle. The weapons have changed, the doctrine has evolved, but the fundamental principle remains. Every Marine is a rifleman. And being a rifleman means more than just carrying a weapon. It means mastering that weapon through training and discipline. It means shooting accurately under stress. It means maintaining standards even when circumstances are difficult. These lessons, learned with the Springfield rifle on Guadalcanal and battlefields before, define what it means to be a Marine rifleman regardless of what rifle a Marine carries. The truth the Springfield revealed wasn't that old weapons are useless. It was that adapting to new realities requires honest assessment of capabilities and limitations. The Marines did that assessment. They honored their traditions while embracing necessary change, and in doing so, they ensured that the next generation of Marines would go into battle with the best tools available, carrying forward the standards and skills learned with rifles that had served their time and earned their retirement. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.